Learn English through story. Unspoken desires. The city had a pulse of its own. The hum of traffic, the murmur of voices on crowded streets, the clinking of glasses in dimly lit bars. It was a rhythm that became second nature, a background melody to the lives of the people who lived there. For most, it was the soundtrack to their daily struggles, dreams, and fleeting moments of joy. But for Eleanor, it was the sound of silence. She had always been a quiet woman, content to stay in the background, observing life rather than participating in it. The bustling city seemed like a reflection of her own mind, full of noise. Yet there was an underlying emptiness that could never quite be filled. She had spent the better part of her 38 years moving through life, in a state of quiet discontent, a passive observer of the world around her, never fully engaging, never speaking the words that lingered in her heart. Eleanor worked as a librarian at a local college, a job that allowed her to keep her distance from people, while still offering a semblance of purpose. She adored books, how they told stories of lives she would never lead, of passions she would never experience. They were safe, they were controlled. There was no risk in a book, no fear of rejection, no danger in opening pages that never asked anything of her but to turn them and read. Her life was a carefully constructed routine. Mornings spent cataloging books, afternoons spent shelving them, and evenings in her small apartment, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and the occasional novel. There were no surprises, no excitement, no sparks of unexpected connection. Eleanor had long since learned to keep her desires buried deep inside, locked away in the recesses of her mind, where they could do no harm. But then, one day, she met him. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Thomas walked into the library. He was new to the college, an artist of sorts, someone who painted and sculpted and lived a life that seemed to hum with color, movement, and possibility. He was the antithesis of everything Eleanor had been. He was tall, with wavy brown hair that always seemed to fall just slightly over his eyes, and a smile that was warm, inviting, and a little too knowing. He had the kind of charm that made people feel seen, not just noticed. And it wasn't long before Eleanor found herself watching him from the far end of the library, unable to tear her eyes away from the way he moved through the space as if he owned it. There was a quiet elegance about him, a way of being in the world that felt effortless, like he had already figured out the parts of life that Eleanor had spent years trying to avoid. He was confident, but not arrogant. He was kind, but not insincere. And in his presence, Eleanor felt a strange, unfamiliar pull, a magnetism that she couldn't explain, but that was impossible to ignore. Over the next few weeks, Thomas became a regular presence in the library. He would come in during the late afternoons, after the rush of students had died down, and settle into one of the cozy chairs near the windows, with a sketchbook in hand. He didn't speak much, but his quiet presence was enough to stir something within Eleanor, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She found herself waiting for him, watching as he entered the library, hoping for a glimpse of him, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would look up from his sketches and catch her eye. But he never did. She was just another face in the background, an invisible fixture in the corner of his world. And yet, the more she observed him, the more she began to feel that undeniable spark of longing, of desire, a yearning for something she couldn't quite name, something she had never allowed herself to pursue. Eleanor knew she was only fooling herself. She was not the type of woman who attracted men like Thomas. She was plain, bookish, introverted. She had built walls around herself to protect her from the vulnerability of rejection, and she had long since buried any hope of a romantic connection beneath the weight of her own self-doubt. But that didn't stop the desires from bubbling up, from creeping into her thoughts when she least expected them. It was late one evening when it happened. The library was nearly empty, the soft flicker of fluorescent lights casting a muted glow over the rows of bookshelves. Eleanor had finished her work for the day, and was preparing to lock up when she noticed Thomas, sitting alone by the window. his sketchbook open, but forgotten in his lap. He stared out at the street, his expression distant, as if lost in a world of his own. There was something melancholy about him in that moment, something that spoke to Eleanor's own quiet despair. She had never seen him like this before. She hesitated for a moment, caught between the safety of her routine and the pull of something unfamiliar. But her feet moved of their own accord, and before she knew it, she was standing in front of him. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft, almost tentative. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't realized she was there. But then, as recognition flickered in his eyes, a small smile tugged at his lips. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm, "I didn't expect to see you here this late." "I was just finishing up," she replied, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I noticed you seemed lost in thought." He gave a small, rueful chuckle. "Yeah, I suppose I was. Just thinking about things. Life mostly." Eleanor sat down across from him, not sure what had compelled her to do so, but unable to retreat back into her usual quiet reserve. There was something about him that made her feel visible in a way she had never felt before. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, as if afraid the question might be too intrusive. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the depth of sadness in his eyes. "I don't know. Just everything, I guess. I moved here for a fresh start, but sometimes I feel like I'm just carrying around all the weight of the things I've left behind. I'm not sure how to move forward, or if I even want to." Eleanor was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't the type to open up to others. She had never been able to share her thoughts and desires with anyone, not in a way that felt real. But as she sat across from him, she found herself wanting to tell him about the ache she had carried for years, the deep loneliness that gnawed at her when no one was watching. She wanted to share with him the unspoken things, the desires she had locked away in her heart, but the words stuck in her throat, unsaid and heavy. "I understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we try, we can't outrun our pasts. They always follow us." Thomas nodded, his gaze dropping to his sketchbook. "Yeah, and the hardest part is not knowing if there's anything worth moving toward. You know?" There it was, the question that hung between them, unspoken but tangible. "Is there anything worth moving toward?" Eleanor looked at him, her heart pounding. She didn't have an answer. She didn't even know what her own desires were anymore, let alone what his might be. But as they sat there, a quiet understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of the desires that neither of them had voiced aloud. They were two people caught in the quiet chaos of their own lives, surrounded by unspoken words and unmet needs. The moment hung in the air, fragile and fleeting. But then, just as quickly as it had come, it passed. Eleanor stood up, her heart racing, her mind still swirling with questions. "I should get going," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's late." Thomas didn't say anything at first, but when she turned to leave, he spoke softly. "Eleanor, I don't know what it is about this place, but I feel like we're more alike than we realize. Maybe we both need to start speaking the words we've been holding back." Eleanor stopped in her tracks, her hand resting on the door handle. She looked back at him, her breath catching in her throat. He was right, of course. There was so much she had left unsaid, so many desires and longings that had built up inside her over the years, quietly festering. Perhaps it was time to start speaking those words. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding from the unspoken desires that had defined her life. But for now, all she could do was nod and walk away, her heart heavy with the weight of all the things she still couldn't say. Days passed, and Eleanor's life resumed its usual rhythm: work, solitude, the occasional foray into the world of literature. But there was something different now, something that lingered like a soft ache beneath the surface. Every time she stepped into the library, her eyes unconsciously sought him out, Thomas, the man who seemed to see her in ways She had never allowed anyone to. The man who had spoken of things that felt too close to home, too painful to confront. She would catch a glimpse of him at his usual spot by the window, sketching, his brow furrowed in concentration, the movements of his hand fluid and confident. But Eleanor never went to him again, at least not in the way she had that night. Their last conversation, if it could even be called that, had been brief, laden with unspoken thoughts, desires, and fears. She hadn't known what to do with it, or with the way it had made her feel, exposed, fragile, and yet strangely free. She felt like a woman caught between two worlds, one that she had known all her life, and one that Thomas had unknowingly opened to her, a world that beckoned with the possibility of connection, of being truly seen. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the quiet restraint she had built around her own emotions, a protective layer, one that had served her well in the past, but had left her disconnected from her own desires. She had lived a life of containment, where everything was measured and calculated. But was it enough? Could she really live the rest of her days in the quiet prison of her own making, keeping the truths of her heart buried deep inside? It was a Thursday when she found herself standing in front of the library's front doors, hesitating. The glass was cold against her fingertips, and the gray sky outside reflected her mood, a muted, cloudy reflection of everything she had been feeling since that night with Thomas. Eleanor had thought of him every day, of the way he had looked at her with a kind of knowing, his words lingering long after he had spoken them. Maybe it wasn't so much his words as it was the possibility they held, the possibility of something unspoken between them, something that neither of them could yet name. Her hand hesitated on the door handle before she pushed it open. The library was quiet, as it usually was at this time of day, but today, she felt an undeniable shift in the air. Her heart began to beat faster, a flutter of nervousness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't long before she saw him, sitting at his usual spot by the window, sketching once again. But this time, he was not alone. A woman sat across from him, laughing lightly at something he had said. Eleanor's chest tightened. There was something about their dynamic, the easy way they spoke to each other, the intimacy in the way the woman leaned toward him, that made her feel like an outsider. She tried to push away the feelings that stirred inside her, the jealousy, the pang of longing that rose too quickly. She had no right to feel this way. She and Thomas were strangers, after all, nothing more. She turned to leave, but stopped herself. No, she wasn't going to retreat again. She wasn't going to hide in the shadows of her own emotions anymore. With a quiet breath, Eleanor made her way across the library, each step more deliberate than the last. She approached the table where Thomas and the woman sat, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm, even though her insides were anything but. He looked up, and for the briefest moment, his eyes softened as they met hers. "Eleanor," he greeted her, a genuine warmth in his smile. The woman across from him turned to glance at Eleanor, offering a polite but neutral smile. "This is Lucy," Thomas said, gesturing toward the woman. "She's in my painting class. We were just discussing the gallery show next month." Eleanor smiled stiffly, nodding in acknowledgement. "It's nice to meet you, Lucy," she said, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. She forced herself to keep her gaze steady, not allowing the flood of insecurities to show on her face. But inside, she couldn't help the wave of uncertainty that washed over her. "Are you here to look for something?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "I didn't know you came in at this time." Eleanor took a slow breath, pushing aside the awkwardness that lingered. "I usually work late," she replied, "but I wanted to ask if you've made any progress on your sketches. I remember you mentioned them last time." Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her directness. "Actually, I've been struggling a bit with the next piece, but maybe I'll let you see it sometime, if you're interested." The words hung between them, and for a moment, Eleanor wondered if she had misjudged everything. Maybe he didn't even see her the way she had imagined. Maybe she had built up an emotional narrative that had no basis in reality. He was just being polite, after all, nothing more. The uncomfortable silence stretched on, but it was broken when Lucy stood up, collecting her things. "Well, I should get going," she said with a friendly smile. "It was great meeting you, Eleanor." "Likewise," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile of her own. She watched as Lucy left, her presence fading into the distance, leaving only the lingering discomfort behind. Thomas turned his attention back to Eleanor, his smile faltering slightly as he studied her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing. Was everything okay? She didn't know. There was a part of her that wanted to confide in him, to say everything that had been building up inside her for so long. But she had never been the type of woman who was open with her feelings. She had always held them back, buried them under the weight of her rationality and self-control. As she stopped herself, the words refusing to come. Instead, she nodded, offering a small, forced smile. "I'm fine. I just haven't been sleeping well lately." Thomas studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to decipher the unspoken truth that she was hiding. Then, with a soft chuckle, he said, "You know, Eleanor, you don't have to keep everything bottled up. We all have our struggles." Her heart skipped a beat, the softness in his voice. The way he looked at her, there was something in it that made her feel vulnerable, exposed. She wanted to tell him everything. How she had spent her life, hiding behind walls of restraint. How she had never allowed herself the freedom to feel anything fully. She wanted to tell him that she had been craving connection for so long, that a part of her wanted to step into the space he offered, to embrace the possibility of something more than her carefully constructed solitude. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she wasn't even sure what she was asking for. "I'll be okay," she said, finally pushing the words out. "I just need some time." Thomas didn't press further, but his gaze softened, and in that moment, Eleanor realized something. He wasn't just being kind. He wasn't just offering her polite conversation. There was something deeper there, a recognition of the pain she had never voiced. "I'll be here if you need to talk," he said quietly, "whenever you're ready." The simplicity of his words, the weight of the unspoken promise, made her heart ache with the quiet intensity of what might have been. As she left the library that evening, the city outside seemed to hum with possibility. There was a part of her that longed to take the leap, to step into the unknown and see where it led. But there was also a part of her that was terrified. Terrified of what she might find if she allowed herself to truly feel. For now, she would retreat. She would stay within the safety of her silence, of her unspoken desires. But Eleanor knew, deep down, that something had shifted. And someday, she would speak those desires. She would allow herself to truly be seen. And perhaps, in doing so, she would find the freedom she had longed for all along. The days that followed were a strange blend of routine and anticipation. Eleanor continued her work in the library, cataloging books and shelving them with the same quiet precision she always had. But now, her thoughts often drifted to Thomas. She couldn't help herself. Every time she caught sight of him, whether it was during one of his late afternoon visits or in the rare moments they crossed paths on campus, her pulse quickened. There was a growing sense of longing, a deep yearning she hadn't felt in years, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. She began to recognize that her feelings for him were not just a passing infatuation. They were something deeper, something that stirred her soul in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But with that realization came a new fear, fear that she wasn't capable of embracing the vulnerability required to connect with him. Her life had been built around self-reliance and emotional distance. How could she possibly open up now? How could she reveal the secrets of her heart when she had spent so long keeping them buried? One particularly rainy evening, when the library had emptied out and she was preparing to leave for the day, she noticed Thomas sitting by the window again. This time, his sketchbook was closed, and he seemed lost in thought, staring out at the rain-soaked streets with an expression that seemed far away, as if he were caught in a world of his own making. Eleanor hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she stood still, her hand resting on the door that would take her out into the world beyond. She could leave, she could turn away, like she always did. She could keep herself hidden, protected from the vulnerability that lay beyond. But there was something in her that refused to let this moment slip away. She had held back for too long, kept her desires silent for too many years. It was time to take the first step. Slowly, she walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the polished floor. When she reached his table, she took a deep breath and sat down without asking for permission. Thomas looked up, surprised, but not entirely unwelcoming. The rain pattered against the windows, the soft sound filling the space between them. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently, his voice always so calm, so inviting. Eleanor nodded, though a part of her wondered if it was really the truth. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant but determined, "about what you said last time, about not bottling things up." Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "I meant it," he said quietly. "You don't have to carry everything on your own. You know that, right?" Her heart raced, and for a moment, she felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into something she couldn't control. "I've been carrying a lot of things," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I've never said out loud, things I've kept hidden for fear of losing control, losing myself." Thomas didn't interrupt. He simply watched her, as though waiting for her to find the courage to continue. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor did. "I've spent my life trying to be perfect, trying to keep everything in its place. But I think I've lost something in doing that. I've buried things I shouldn't have, and I've kept myself isolated in ways I never realized until now." Thomas's gaze remained steady, his expression one of understanding, not pity. "You're not alone in feeling that way. A lot of people do it, hide, protect themselves from the world, from the things that scare them. But the truth is, the things we keep hidden inside, they tend to weigh us down more than we realize." Eleanor met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know how to stop hiding. How do you let go of the things you've held onto for so long?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, the soft glow of the streetlights casting shadows across his face. "You don't let go all at once," he said thoughtfully. "It's a slow process, a journey of trusting yourself enough to let things out little by little. But the first step is always the hardest. It's about speaking your truth, no matter how messy it might feel. Once you do, you'll start to see that the weight you've been carrying is a lot lighter than you thought." For the first time, Eleanor felt the full weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent so much time afraid of vulnerability, of showing any part of herself that might not fit the neat and tidy version of who she believed she should be. But now, in the quiet of the library, she realized that there was strength in imperfection, in honesty, in allowing herself to be human. "I've spent so much time in my head," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I've convinced myself that being strong means keeping everything inside, keeping everything under control. But I think I've forgotten what it feels like to really live, to really feel." Thomas was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft, but filled with a quiet strength. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. I can't promise to have all the answers, but I'm here. And sometimes that's enough." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, a wave of emotion crashing over her, and for the first time in years, she didn't hold it back. She let the tears fall, not as a sign of weakness, but as a release and acknowledgement of everything she had kept hidden, of everything she had been afraid to admit, even to herself. In that moment, as the rain continued to fall outside, and the soft light of the library flickered in the background, Eleanor realized something profound. Vulnerability was not a weakness. It was not something to be feared. It was a path to freedom, the freedom to be her truest self, to embrace the desires and longings that had been buried for so long. And in that freedom, there was connection. Thomas didn't say anything as she wiped away her tears. He simply sat there, a silent presence, offering her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. "I'm scared," she admitted softly, "but I think I'm ready to try. I think I'm ready to start speaking the things I've kept inside." He smiled warmly, his eyes kind. "I think that's the bravest thing you can do." As Eleanor left the library that night, the city seemed different somehow. The streets were still wet from the rain, but the air felt fresher, the world a little brighter. She was no longer weighed down by the unspoken desires that had once held her captive. She had spoken them, and in doing so, she had freed herself. Unspoken desires teaches us that the things we keep hidden, whether they are emotions, desires, or truths about ourselves, have the power to weigh us down and prevent us from truly living. Vulnerability is often seen as a weakness, but in reality, it is the key to connection, self-acceptance, and emotional freedom. When we allow ourselves to speak the things we've kept inside, we release not only the weight of our burdens, but also the fear that holds us back from embracing life fully. True strength lies not in control, but in the courage to be open, to be imperfect, and to let others see us for who we truly are. Only then can we experience the freedom to grow, to love, and to live authentically. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoy, then please like and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel.